Greetings and welcome to our channel. The year is 1305 and London's streets are alive with the clamour of merchants and the rhythmic thud of horse hooves on the cobblestone streets. But on this particular August morning, a different noise is about to fill the air. A bloodthirsty crowd is gathering to witness what will become one of the most infamous executions in history. They've come to watch the death of William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had the audacity to challenge the English monarchy and unite his people against foreign control. What unfolded that day was more than a simple execution. It was a meticulously planned act of cruelty designed to annihilate both a man and the powerful symbol he embodied. Popular culture, influenced by Hollywood films and romanticized stories, has often softened the reality of Wallace's final moments, portraying his death as a swift and noble end for a brave hero. However, the truth was far more sinister and brutal. King Edward I, famously known as Longshanks, had conceived Wallace's punishment not just as vengeance, but as a chilling warning meant to resonate for generations to come. This was a death intended to be so horrific, so public, and so thoroughly documented that it would deter anyone who dared to challenge English authority. The chosen method was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for traitors and considered the ultimate form of judicial cruelty in medieval England. The objective wasn't just to end a life, it was to systematically dismantle a person's humanity, extinguish hope, and create a terrifying spectacle that would forever haunt the collective memory of Scotland. Today, we will look beyond the myths to examine the raw, unvarnished reality of William Wallace's final hours. To truly understand the horror of his execution, we must first understand the historical context that gave rise to it. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, medieval Scotland was a nation torn between its desire for independence and the threat of subjugation. During this time, the very idea of a unified Scottish nation was still emerging, and allegiance was often a matter of survival rather than national pride. The Scottish Wars of Independence began after a succession crisis, and King Edward I seized the opportunity to bring Scotland under direct English rule, seeing it as nothing more than a rebellious English province. William Wallace rose from this turmoil not as a power-hungry nobleman, but as a minor landowner, driven by a personal tragedy and a deep sense of national outrage. His family had suffered under the English occupation, and when he led the charge at Stirling Bridge in 1297, he did so with the fury of a man who had lost everything and the vision of a leader who saw what Scotland could become. His victory there was more than a tactical success. It was a powerful symbol, proving that the English cavalry could be defeated and that Scottish independence was not just a fantasy. However, King Edward I was not a ruler who tolerated insubordination. Known for his brutal suppression of Welsh rebellions and the expulsion of the Jewish community from England, Longshanks understood that rebellion, like fire, had to be completely extinguished to prevent it from spreading. Wallace's success had to be not only reversed, but also turned into a grim lesson. The English king needed to demonstrate that challenging his authority would lead to consequences so extreme that they would prevent future generations from even considering resistance. The political climate of 1305 was critical to understanding Wallace's fate. By then, many of the Scottish nobles had already surrendered to Edward, viewing cooperation as a better option than complete destruction. Wallace's continued fight made him an enemy not just of England, but also an embarrassment to the Scottish aristocracy who had chosen to submit. His capture became a top priority for both military and political reasons. His very existence undermined the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender. The search for William Wallace went on for years, utilizing a vast network of spies, informants, and collaborators. Edward I had placed a significant reward on Wallace's head, and the English administration in Scotland worked relentlessly to isolate him from any potential supporters. The net slowly closed in on him as former allies turned against him, driven by fear, greed, or the simple desire to survive in a world where being associated with Wallace had become a death sentence. The betrayal, as is often the case in such stories, came from an insider. In August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely due to the betrayal of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule. The exact details are still debated by historians, but the outcome was undeniable. The man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance was now in English hands. His capture was celebrated in London as a great victory, but for Edward I, it was only the beginning of what he intended to be Wallace's ultimate humiliation. The journey from Scotland to London was a form of torture in itself, designed to break Wallace's spirit before his final punishment. Bound and under heavy guard, he was paraded through English towns, where crowds gathered to get a glimpse of the infamous Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare in its most calculated form, transforming a hero into a public spectacle, a leader into a mere curiosity. By the time he reached London, Wallace had already endured weeks of degradation, but his ordeal was far from over. The trial of William Wallace was a legal charade, but it served an important propaganda function for the English crown. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and a variety of other crimes against the English crown. The irony was not lost on those present. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king he had never recognized as his sovereign. When given the chance to speak, Wallace reportedly declared that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never been Edward's subject. This defiant statement sealed his fate, although the outcome had been decided in advance. The trial was a performance designed to provide a legal pretext for a predetermined execution. The judges, all appointed by Edward I, had no intention of showing mercy to the man who had become the very embodiment of Scottish resistance. The charges against Wallace were carefully chosen to justify the severity of his punishment. Treason was the most serious offence, punishable by the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The additional charges of murder and sacrilege, which referred to his attacks on English soldiers and clergy, were designed to paint him as a common criminal rather than a warrior. The English legal system had been weaponized as a tool of state terror, and Wallace was to be its most prominent victim. The sentence was pronounced with solemn gravity. Wallace was to be dragged through the streets of London, hanged by the neck, but not until dead, disemboweled while still conscious, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each part of this punishment held a symbolic meaning. The dragging represented his humiliation, the hanging his rejection by God, the disembowelment his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his complete annihilation. This was not merely an execution, it was a total destruction of the individual. The morning of August 23, 1305, was clear and warm in London. The city had been preparing for this spectacle for days. Scaffolds had been built, and crowds had gathered from all over England to witness the death of the Scottish rebel. The authorities had turned Wallace's execution into a public holiday, complete with vendors selling food and drinks to the masses. This was not just about justice, it was a form of entertainment, a stark reminder of the power of the English crown and the fate that awaited those who dared to defy it. Wallace was first stripped and tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame that would be used to drag him through the streets of London. The route had been meticulously planned to maximize both his humiliation and the spectacle. Starting from the Tower of London, where he had been held, the procession moved through the city's busiest districts to ensure that as many people as possible would witness his degradation. The rough cobblestones tore at his flesh as he was dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood that marked his final journey. The crowds that lined the streets were a mix of curious onlookers, English patriots, and those who simply enjoyed watching others suffer. Medieval executions were public events that served both as entertainment and as a powerful demonstration of royal authority. Spectators jeered and threw refuse at Wallace as he passed, their behavior encouraged by the authorities who wanted to ensure that his final moments were as humiliating as possible. This was a massive, state-sponsored act of cruelty. The procession moved at a slow pace, allowing maximum time for the crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged. Contemporary accounts say that he remained conscious throughout this agonizing ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he was looking beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or pure shock is unknown, but witnesses noted that he never cried out or begged for mercy. This detail would later become a part of his legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a scaffold had been specifically erected for Wallace's death. The crowd here was even larger and more rowdy than along the route, with vendors selling pies and ale to spectators who had claimed the best viewing spots hours earlier. This carnival-like atmosphere was intentional. The English authorities wanted Wallace's death to be remembered not as a martyrdom, but as a celebration of English justice and power. The executioner, a professional who had likely performed dozens of such killings, began his work with practiced efficiency. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned to ensure slow strangulation, rather than a quick death from a broken neck. The crowd watched as he struggled for air, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of death by asphyxiation. But just as he began to lose consciousness, he was cut down, still alive and still aware of what was happening to him. What followed was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal. While Wallace was still conscious, the executioner began the process of disembowelment. Using a sharp knife, he cut open Wallace's abdomen and began removing his internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts describe the victim's screams as something unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest levels of human suffering. The executioner held up each organ for the crowd to see before throwing it into a fire that had been prepared for this purpose. The symbolism of burning Wallace's entrails was not accidental. In medieval thinking, the bowels were believed to be the seat of emotions and compassion. By burning them while he watched, the executioner was symbolically destroying Wallace's humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh and organs permeated the air, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through it all, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, even as his body was systematically dismantled. Some accounts suggest that he continued to speak, though what he said has been lost to history. The executioner's skill was not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. Death would be a release, not the culmination of his suffering. Finally, and mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his gruesome work. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, finally ending his suffering. But even in death, the humiliation continued. His head was held up for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the severed neck, before being set aside for later display. His body was then cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection, like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated as his execution. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it, and then mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were publicly displayed as reminders of the fate that awaited rebels. This distribution of Wallace's body parts was more than just brutality, it was a form of political communication. Each piece served as a message to the local population, a physical reminder of English power and the consequences of resistance. The English understood that symbols could be as powerful as armies, and Wallace's dismembered body became a symbol of English dominance over Scotland. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution was exactly what Edward I had hoped for. The brutal spectacle had served its purpose, and Scottish resistance seemed to crumble in the face of such an overwhelming display of English power. Many who had supported Wallace either fled the country or submitted to English rule, concluding that no cause was worth such a horrific death. The execution had successfully transformed a symbol of resistance into a warning against rebellion. However, Edward I had miscalculated the Scottish response to Wallace's martyrdom. Instead of crushing Scottish resistance, the sheer brutality of his execution actually strengthened it. The very horror of his death became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland, was reportedly moved to action by the sight of Wallace's execution, seeing in it the true face of English rule. The manner of Wallace's death also influenced the tactics of future Scottish resistance. The lesson was clear: capture by the English meant unimaginable torture and humiliation. This understanding led to a more desperate and determined form of warfare, where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle to surrender. Wallace's execution had created a culture of no quarter, where mercy was neither expected nor given. The political consequences extended beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms watched the Wallace execution with a mix of interest and horror, seeing in it a demonstration of English methods that could easily be applied to them. The brutality of the execution became a part of England's reputation, contributing to the isolation that would later complicate English foreign policy. Edward I's message of strength had been received, but so had his message of cruelty. The historical documentation of Wallace's execution is extensive, drawn from multiple contemporary sources that provide a remarkably detailed picture of the event. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, describes the execution in clinical detail, noting the crowd's reaction and the duration of Wallace's suffering. While these accounts are biased toward the English perspective, they offer valuable insight into medieval attitudes toward justice and punishment. Scottish sources, though fewer in number, offer a different view of the execution. The Chronicle of John of Fordun portrays Wallace as a martyr who faced death with dignity and courage, emphasizing his refusal to beg for mercy or renounce his cause. These accounts, while possibly romanticized, reflect the deep impact of Wallace's death on Scottish national consciousness and the transformation of a military defeat into a moral victory. The legal records of Wallace's trial and execution provide perhaps the most objective account of the events. These documents, preserved in the English National Archives, reveal the careful planning that went into both the trial and the execution. Every detail was documented, from the charges against Wallace to the disposal of his remains, which suggests that the English authorities understood the historical significance of what they were doing. Witness accounts from both English and Scottish observers add additional layers of detail about the execution. Some describe the crowd's bloodthirsty enthusiasm, while others note the apparent dignity with which Wallace faced his death. These varied perspectives highlight the complexity of the event and its different meanings for different audiences. The legacy of William Wallace's execution extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his death. In the centuries that followed, his story became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring generations of Scots to resist foreign domination. The very brutality of his execution transformed him from a failed rebel into a symbol of martyrdom and resistance that proved more powerful in death than he had been in life. The execution also influenced the development of international law and the concepts of human rights. Later legal scholars would point to Wallace's treatment as an example of judicial cruelty that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The idea that even enemies of the state deserved basic human treatment began to emerge, partly as a reaction to excesses like Wallace's execution. The cultural impact of Wallace's death can be seen in the literature, art, and music that emerged in subsequent centuries. From medieval ballads to modern films, his story has been told and retold, with each generation finding new meaning in his sacrifice. The execution scene in particular has become a powerful symbol of the struggle between oppression and freedom, tyranny and justice. The psychological impact on the Scottish people was profound and lasting. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma that became a part of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that united the nation in ways that military victory alone could not have. The horror of his death became a source of strength, proving that some things were worth suffering for and that dignity could be maintained even in the face of ultimate degradation. The method of execution chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was itself a statement about the nature of medieval justice and the relationship between a ruler and his subjects. This particular form of execution was reserved for traitors, those who had violated the sacred bond between king and subject. By applying it to Wallace, Edward the Fan was asserting that all inhabitants of the British Isles were his subjects, whether they acknowledged it or not. The public nature of the execution was equally significant. Medieval justice was theatre designed to reinforce social hierarchies and political relationships through spectacle. Wallace's execution was perhaps the most elaborate such performance of its era, involving not just the physical destruction of the victim, but the psychological conditioning of the audience. The crowd was not just witnessing justice, they were participating in a ritual of state power. The detailed documentation of the execution suggests that the English authorities understood they were creating a historical moment. The careful recording of every detail, from the route of the procession to the disposal of the body parts, indicates that this was intended to be remembered. The execution was not just about punishing Wallace, but about creating a narrative that would serve English interests for generations to come. The international dimension of the execution should not be overlooked. Medieval Europe was an interconnected world where news traveled quickly and reputation mattered enormously. Wallace's execution was witnessed by foreign dignitaries and reported across the continent, contributing to England's reputation as a power willing to use extreme measures to maintain control. This reputation would influence diplomatic relations for decades to come. As we reflect on the horror of William Wallace's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the exercise of power. The crowds that gathered to watch his suffering were not monsters, but ordinary people who had been conditioned to accept and even enjoy the systematic destruction of another human being. Their enthusiasm for the spectacle reveals the capacity for cruelty that exists within civilized society when it is given official sanction. The execution also demonstrates how quickly the extraordinary can become routine. The executioner who dismembered Wallace was a professional, skilled in the art of prolonging suffering. The officials who organized the event were bureaucrats following established procedures for dealing with traitors. The normalization of extreme cruelty is perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty itself, suggesting that civilization is always more fragile than we might believe. The transformation of Wallace from a rebel to a martyr illustrates the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward I intended the execution to demonstrate the futility of resistance, but instead it created a powerful symbol of the nobility of sacrificing for a principle. The very excess of the execution contributed to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so complete that it became sublime, transcending its immediate purpose to become something larger. The enduring fascination with Wallace's story speaks to our need for heroes who embody our highest ideals, even, or perhaps especially, in the face of ultimate suffering. His execution reminds us that the greatest victories are sometimes moral rather than military, that dignity can be maintained even when everything else is stripped away, and that the human spirit can triumph even in the moment of the body's destruction. The story of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a story about the price of freedom and the cost of principle. In our comfortable modern world, it is easy to forget that the liberties we take for granted were purchased with the blood and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's horrific death serves as a reminder that freedom is never free, and that those who enjoy it have a responsibility to honor the sacrifice of those who died for it. Today, as we face our own challenges to freedom and human dignity, Wallace's story remains relevant. The methods may have changed, but the fundamental struggle between oppression and liberty continues. His execution reminds us that there are principles worth suffering for, causes worth dying for, and that the choice between freedom and security is one that each generation must make for itself. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London still echo with the message that some things are worth any price, and that the human spirit, even when broken, can still inspire others to carry on the fight.